Hello, everyone. What you see here is the landing page, the home page of our Canvas site. And about the only valuable thing on this page are these pictures. And they are pictures of some of the writers, some of the authors that we'll be reading for this course. Right in the center there is W.E.B. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. And it is Du Bois. He was an American, so French name, American pronunciation. W.E.B. Du Bois. The most important authors, thinkers in American history. We'll be reading one thing from him. To his right is Immanuel Kant, the great German Enlightenment philosopher. We'll be reading a short piece by him. To Du Bois's left there is Mary Wollstonecraft, author of the Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Very, very important Enlightenment 18th century thinker, and probably more famous of being Mary Shelley's mother, author of Frankenstein, which we won't be reading. Just below them on the left, that's Adam Smith, probably the most important economist of all time, at least in the English language. We'll be reading a little bit of his Wealth of Nations. And to his right is Karl Marx, maybe the most important social thinker of the modern period. We'll be reading just one section of Communist Manifesto, which he co-wrote with his friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels. I like putting pictures of these people up because I do revere them. This is a course that's essentially still a classics course. No, not everything we read, I think, it could be called a classic, and I'll let you know for obvious, maybe not so obvious reasons why I wouldn't call it a classic. But these are the authors of the classics, and these are the people typically that we'll be reading for this course. It is still a classics course or core text course, as these things have come to be known. That is, core text, the texts that are at the core, like the things that it's sort of taken for granted that you've read. You know, there's plenty of things that we want to read and contemporary authors that we want to read, but there's a core of things that are sort of taken for granted as the background. You know, like if you want to write something in contemporary feminism, you should, and there are contemporary feminist writers that you're interested in reading and responding to. But in the background, there's Mary Wollstonecraft and A Vindication of the Rights of Woman from 1792. If you're interested in contemporary race relations in America, Afro-American studies, there's plenty of interesting and important contemporary authors that you'll want to read and respond to. But then there's W.E.B. Du Bois, who is part of the core, the background, the thing that you simply have to have read if you want to enter into that conversation. There is contemporary political work, more general political theory that you might be interested in reading, and plenty of interesting contemporary authors. And then there's Kant, one of the greatest philosophers of all time. And what is enlightenment? Now, he wrote a lot of stuff, and what is enlightenment is just one little piece that he wrote, but a classic piece about free speech and about enlightenment and about what contemporary societies are supposed to be like. And I could say similar things about Smith and Marx and other people that we read that are not pictured here. But that's the idea of a core text course or a classics course, is that we have plenty of things in the contemporary world, that conversations that are going on, and we will become part of those conversations, whether they're about political rights or whether they're about economic freedom or whether they're about the purpose of government or what government should do, or whether they're about race relations or whether they're about feminism. And the idea of core text is that behind all this, there are classic texts that form such an important part of that conversation that even if we haven't read them, their influence is so clear on the people that we do read that we kind of have read them indirectly, but here is our chance to read them directly and to become more informed in our discussion of the great issues of our age. And that's what a course like this is for. So here we are. Yes, we're on the landing page. And there's a syllabus, and there's all sorts of things you can look at. But the course is all here under modules, right? That's where you go, and that's where you find everything for the course. Please look at this introductory section where this video is. Practical course tour, course schedule, etc. But here are the readings arranged by week. I'd just like to give you an overview of the kind of things that we'll read and why I chose them. Uh, my inspiration for doing this course was that I wanted to do a course that started with Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? I wanted to do something on that because it seemed to me that that was such an incredibly important issue for us, the issue of freedom of speech. And I'm not telling you what to think about freedom of speech. I don't know, but freedom of speech seems to be a key issue in our society, in all sorts of different, reflected in all sorts of different issues, from from Elon Musk wanting to buy Twitter to what people say in public. And I mean, it just seems that this is really a time to go back to fundamentals. Kant's idea of the free public use of reason, and the Declaration. What follows from that? These Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment documents. This great document from the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This chapter 2 of Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It's classic Enlightenment statement of claiming the idea that women must be included in this new consciousness of individual dignity and individual rights. It's incredibly important. The Declaration of Independence from the American Revolution. Just one of the Federalist Papers, the great work of Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, who were writing these furious newspaper articles about what they thought the American Constitution should look like. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, the Constitution. These are all classic, all these things are classic documents in modern history. If we consider modern history the history of the new democratic liberal societies that were emerging out of the monarchies and other situations in the Middle Ages, these are some of the core documents discussing some of the most important questions of modern societies. Individual rights, like right to free speech, but other rights too, the place of women, what modern governments should look like. I think these are just absolutely essential texts. And then we get to week 3. And I think week 3 needs some explaining, especially the first reading there from George Fitzhugh. George Fitzhugh was a notorious apologist for American slavery and for slavery in general. And I really hesitate to put that kind of reading up, considering, it's wrong, right? I mean, it's just wrong. But I thought that since this sort of the later readings this week from Frederick Douglass and then the Declaration of Sentiments from the Seneca Fall Convention, these classic statements of African American and women's objections to the kind of society that the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence built, that excluded, obviously, black people from, most of them at least, from enjoyment of the kind of rights that are set out in those documents. And of course, women too. I thought that for a proper appreciation of those documents, we should have some idea, at least when it comes to the rights of black people, African Americans, what were the attitudes of the time that these people were fighting. And George Fitzhugh, I think, not being a scholar of American history and certainly not being a scholar of apologists for American slavery, it just seemed to me that George Fitzhugh was a worthy opponent. Yes, he was definitely a racist. There's no question about it. But just to give ourselves a sense of what was the intellectual climate of the 19th century in America that people like Frederick Douglass were contending with, I think we need to know that. And so, yes, I hesitate to put up the Fitzhugh, but I think that it's definitely worth reading, and I think maybe necessary if you want to really gain a grasp of what the climate was, or at least one voice in that climate, the political climate of America in the 1800s and the 19th century. So I'm not endorsing what Fitzhugh wrote by any means. I don't think anybody could, but I think it's a very valuable document to read. Then we move on to week 4, which is really about modern economic thought. I don't think you can really get a full notion of what modern political thought is and social thought is without having some idea of modern economic thought. And certainly these excerpts from Locke, the Second Treatise of Government, from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and then from the Communist Manifesto give us some sense, some small sense of what the issues were in economics. Locke's defense of the institution of private property, his philosophical grounding, he thinks of what legitimates private property, what is the foundation of private property. Smith's notion in chapter 2 of the nature of human beings as essentially economic beings, as trading beings, is incredibly influential. And then, of course, the diagnosis on the part of Marx and Engels in 1848 of what they saw not only the ills of modern capitalist society based upon the notion of private property, but why they thought that it needed to be overcome and would, in their minds, inevitably be overcome and be replaced by something where there was no private property. I think that these readings from week 4 are really essential to start you off sort of some knowledge of what the root issues were in the discussion of economics in the early modern period. Then we have really something about science, because I think also if we're thinking about modern social thought, which is after all kind of what this class is, it's called the common good. So it's really about social and political thought. We have to also take into account modern science and the way that modern science impacts on other issues. So we're going all the way back to a text that's quite a bit earlier than anything else we're reading, even 75 years before John Locke's second treatise, and that is Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, really defending his way of doing science and really defending modern science, and especially arguing that modern science is not a threat to religion. And then jumping ahead to Darwin's summary of his argument in The Descent of Man, where he applies evolutionary theory to human beings, and pretty much says the only way you can really understand human nature is by understanding how it evolved. And that would include our intellectual and moral capacities. And then, also unusual for this class, a fairly modern document by John Paul II about evolutionary theory and how he thinks Catholic biologists need to think about evolutionary theory. Finally, we get to Du Bois, who is kind of an essential touchstone, I think, for a course like this. His essay, with some irony, The Souls of White Folk. And of course, Du Bois had published a few years before a seminal work called The Souls of Black Folk, which is a collection of his essays on race and race relations in America, and some autobiographical stuff too. Really classic book. This is an essay that he published during World War One, crucially called The Souls of White Folk, which is a really searing indictment not only of white supremacy in America and the world, but of colonialism. Giving you Kipling's The White Man's Burden, I also hesitate to do that, but I thought that for Du Bois's argument there, and the points that he makes, to make more sense, we should get some sense of the kind of attitudes that he was arguing against. And I thought Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, would be a fairly good way to establish that context. I mean, Kipling, I would consider him still a great writer of that period. I've read Kipling, but there's just no doubt that he was a kind of a racist and that he was an apologist for imperialism. That's what this essay is most obviously about. It's about this notion of white supremacy and European imperialism, European and American imperialism, because he wrote it while he was in America, I believe, and he's definitely wrote it to encourage the American public to become more imperialistic during the Spanish American War. I don't endorse Kipling's racial or imperialist attitudes, but again, like with the George Fitzhugh, I think it's important to read this stuff and to just to establish the kind of context in which maybe other things are written, especially here, the Du Bois. Finally, we'll end with a document from approximately 1945, 1950, which is the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I think is a good way to end. It's a 20th century document. It's quite a bit more modern than most of the other things that we read. But it brings us back to the first couple weeks of the course, which is really about human rights. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens from 1789 is the earliest document that I know that actually uses that expression, human rights. And in a way, it's the most important central idea of this whole course. So, this takes you to the website, the UN website, where this document can be found. I think it's a good way to end the course because it's an expression, perhaps, of our highest aspirations as a species for what we want to be and what we want human life on this planet to be. Uh, wow, there's Eleanor Roosevelt on the right hand side. Amazing. A more contemporary, well, almost 70, 75 years ago now, but a more contemporary articulation of what we aspire to be as a species and how we aspire to value the life of every human being. This idea of human rights and what people deserve and how they deserve to be treated. Pretty amazing document. So, excuse me, that is the course. That's a theoretical overview of the course. Like this is a course in social and political thought, and especially social and political thought of the modern period of the past 200 or 300 years. It is Eurocentric in the sense that it's really about Western thought as opposed to Eastern thought. I'm not qualified in other traditions. This is not to say they're not important. It's just I wouldn't know where to begin. Um, Looking at Eastern political thought, looking at non-Western political thought, this is the only thing that I really know. I mean, I hope that it has a diversity of voices. I hope that the inclusion of people like Douglas and Wollstonecraft and Du Bois and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and frankly, Marx and Engels as being revolutionaries. I hope that it is sufficiently diverse. It should be because those voices are incredibly important to understanding politics in the modern period. There's just no way of understanding what the main issues are in social and political thought in the West unless you take into account imperialism, exploitation, misogyny, racism. And I hope that they are represented here. So that's basically the course. What do I want you to get out of it? I want it to be a part of your education. I want you to think about these texts and be affected by them. You don't have to agree with them. That's not part of the course. We're just reading them and thinking whatever we want about them. But I think that you're a college student. You're getting your education. So there are certain texts you just should be familiar with. I mean, you should be familiar with the Communist Manifesto. You should be familiar with Darwin. You should be familiar with Locke and Wollstonecraft and Kant. They're part of becoming an educated person. So I hope you enjoy the course. I certainly enjoy teaching it because I think these are really important texts to know and to read and to think about.